world monopoly on trees, and our country's bordered by 3 different seas.
Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. We invented the zipper, we got expertise. We made insulin to combat disease. Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koala chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian.
Et si ce n'était pas assez, on a 2 langues officielles, l'anglais et le français. Ooh la la.
Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. Where else do you find mounted police or go to the hospital and not pay fees? I know that you wanna be Canadian, please.
And when fresh water's in high demand, we got the world's largest supply on hand. So you know that we can make a pretty good friend, but it's even better if you can.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koala chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian.
So you're thinking to yourself, how do I live in this beautiful country? Well, I've got some steps for you to follow.
Step 1, lose the gun. Step 2, buy a canoe. Step 3, live multiculturally. Step 4, you ready? There is no war. We got beavers, caribou, and moose. We got buffalo bears and Canadian goose. And we're sorry about Celine Dion, but she did do that good song for James Cameron. Cameron.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koalas chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The Greeks all chill with Socrates, can't build a wall like the Chinese, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. In Kenya they have safaris with mixed lots of other countries, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. Even if in winter things tend to freeze, we got the world monopoly on trees, and our country's bordered by 3 different seas.
Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. We invented the zipper, we got expertise. We made insulin to combat disease. Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koala chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian.
Et si ce n'était pas assez, on a 2 langues officielles, l'anglais et le français. Ooh la la.
Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. Where else do you find mounted police or go to the hospital and not pay fees? I know that you wanna be Canadian, please.
And when fresh water's in high demand, we got the world's largest supply on hand. So you know that we can make a pretty good friend, but it's even better if you can.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koalas chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian.
So you're thinking to yourself, how do I live in this beautiful country? Well, I've got some steps for you to follow.
Step 1, lose the gun. Step 2, buy a canoe. Step 3, live multiculturally. Step 4, you ready? There is no war. We got beavers, caribou, and moose. We got buffalo bears and Canadian goose. And we're sorry about Celine Dion, but she did do that good song for James Cameron. Cameron.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koalas chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The Greeks all chill with Socrates, can't build a wall like the Chinese, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. In Kenya they have safaris with mixed lots of other countries, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. Even if in winter things tend to freeze, we got the world monopoly on countries, and our country's bordered by 3 different seas.
Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. We invented the zipper, we got expertise. We made insulin to combat disease. Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koalas chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian.
Et si ce n'était pas assez, on a 2 langues officielles, l'anglais et le français. Ooh la la.
Yeah, I know that you wanna be Canadian, please. Where else do you find mounted police or go to the hospital and not pay fees? I know that you wanna be Canadian, please.
And when fresh water's in high demand, we got the world's largest supply on hand. So you know that we can make a pretty good friend, but it's even better if you can be.
We took out the monarchy, the U.S. has the money, but I know that you wanna be Canadian. The French will get the wine and cheese, koalas chew with the Aussies, but I know that you wanna be Canadian.
So you're thinking to yourself, how do I live in this beautiful country? Well, I've got some steps for you to follow.
Step 1, lose the gun. Step 2, buy a canoe. Step 3, live multiculturally. Step 4, you ready? There is no more. We got beavers, caribou, and moose. We got buffalo, bears, and Canadian goose. And we're sorry about Celine Dion, but she did do that good song for James Cameron.
Here in our capital city, families and small businesses have been enduring illegal obstruction of their neighborhoods, occupying streets, harassing people, breaking the law. This is not a peaceful protest.
Hey there, bud, or buds, or buddies, or whatever the fuck the Canadian people are saying these days. I have no idea. Yo! Sorry for the late Wednesday streams, but unfortunately I got the kid until 7, so Wednesdays it's going to be a little later stream, which means most people are probably going to be viewing this in the future. But as I promised, part 2 of Needle Points. I suppose I should give a little context for anybody who's just viewing. Stream, last stream, Monday stream. I started broadcasting a scientific journal entry on the behavioral immune system, basically, which is a kind of a system in our brains that's kind of very archaic. We haven't really had to talk about it because we haven't had a pandemic in, like 100 years. So, basically, the behavioral system in our brains is turned on in order to prevent us from getting an infection, because our immune system attacks the infection once you've got it. The behavioral immune system tries to keep you from getting it in the first place, which means it can be triggered by such things as people sneezing and touching surfaces, or things that gross us out, that trigger disgust and avoidance. And if there's no opportunity for avoidance, it can also invoke the feeling of rage. I thought that what this was, Jordan Peterson first thought this clearly, but I thought this was kind of important information, because while we are basically a world divided at this point, I thought maybe it would do good to give a little bit of understanding to the other side of the aisle. I will admit honestly that for the longest time I thought anti-vaxxers were wootards, loonies, kooks, negligent. I did not like them. I had much disdain. However, listening to Norman Doidge's needle points, I'm starting to understand that some of their fears or discontentment or avoidance of vaccines were legit. Hey, Red Feather. And that I don't feel any any sort of way anymore, other than I understand where they're coming from. I don't agree, but there's a level of understanding to be had. And so last stream, it was noted that basically by the constant push of saying vaccines are the be and all to everything, it wasn't a means to an end. It was the end, period. And it's very interesting, only because vaccines in and of itself are meant to work inside of nature, not to defeat nature. So whenever there are pandemics or diseases and such, it's not meant to defeat a disease. It's meant to work with the confines of nature. However, with COVID, we've decided we're going to crush the disease. We're going to defeat it. We're going to work outside of the confines of nature, and it's not going to be a means to an end. It's going to be the end, period. And that has triggered the behavioral immune system, because those that got vaccinated and followed all the rules and did all of the things should be able to avoid COVID, and COVID was played up to be to make people rather afraid. So then when you need to have social get-togethers like Christmas, when you need to be stuck in an elevator with somebody, when there's no way to avoid COVID because who's vaccinated and who's not? What about those not wearing a mask? When it's surrounding you, it's like a rat in a corner where its last stand is to bite back. And so the behavioral immune system has been triggered with the vaccinated, so that the unvaccinated is disgusting, distasteful, and then they get angry, and then it triggers rage. And the other side, the unvaccinated, for fear of either what's in the vaccine or getting a cloned version of COVID, or from government misuse, mistrust, pharmacies, lack of transparency and whatnot, their behavioral immune system has been triggered to where they want to avoid that vaccine as much as possible. At some point, we hit a ceiling where those that were going to get vaxxed did get vaxxed, and those that weren't, good luck persuading them. And the government moved into coercion and forcing it, because they realized they hit a vaccine ceiling. And they decided that everybody vaccinated, or we're all just going to be stuck in isolation forever, and we're going to kill grandma. And so now you have the behavioral immune system that has been switched on and triggers rage. And you've got both sides just warring it out. And whether it's under dissolution or truth or misleading facts or actual facts or whatnot, the problem is that these switches in our minds to keep us from getting sick and dying, they're not, you don't do it. You don't just flick it on. You don't just flick it off. It's not a choice anymore. It triggers a fight, flight, freeze. It triggers people under the surface into rage and hate and anger that is unwillful, unintentional. And I often wonder, is this the reason why somebody who genuinely would be a decent human can turn to somebody? Like, for example, I was in an elevator and my son wasn't wearing a mask, and this older lady said, "I hope you get COVID and die. You're going to die." And my thought to that was, what kind of a person do you have to be to say in front of my child that I'm going to die or he's going to die? Like, normally that would be unthinkable to say. But when you're starting to have fight, flight, freeze activated, and rage and anger, all of these things that are working in our brains to keep us on the survival trend, is it intentional at this point, or is it just something that is naturally going to occur? I used to think, you're now a terrible person. You're an asshole. When really it's things that are beyond our comprehension, understanding, and unless you have a very good self-awareness to be able to stand there and look at yourself in the mirror and go, wait. I feel like lashing out at this person, but this isn't correct behavior. If you don't have that, then this is involuntary and misleading, so that you just hate each other in something that is an involuntary trigger from an ancient mechanism in our minds that at one point in time was needed for the survival of, your tribe, your species, your group. And now it is obsolete. It actually takes you back to the commercials about allergy meds, where it's like, I have to just explain, it's not a cold, it's allergies. I'm not sick, it's fucking allergies. You're not going to get sick, it's fucking allergies. And I wonder if that's just been just set on maximum, and we're just all sitting in a little pressure cooker and it's about to explode. So that's why I'm very gung-ho about sharing needle points, even with, the small community that we have on this channel. Even if it just changes the perception and the understanding of a small group of people, I'm grateful for that. Ahoy hoy, credible threat. Welcome back. Oh, and no problem. Although I do have to warn you, credible threat. I'm not very The only thing I know about the Welsh is they like sheep. B, question and answer games, unless I know anything about the subject matter, I'm just going to space out. I'm slightly autistic. I'm not the funnest YouTuber around, okay? I'm not the funnest. So, without any more nonsense, I will play part 2 of Needle Points, and then I believe, as long as Jen remembers, she will be leading the Friday stream, and if she doesn't, then I'll be playing part 3. So let me just queue up my awesome OBS stuff. Oh, there we go, look at that. Smooth, flawless, blind girl. Yes, here we go.
It's a fascinating moment when this sort of crystallization happens in a mass culture like America's, because seemingly overnight, even the definition of legitimate speech or thought or action also changes. Tocqueville observed that quite abruptly, a person can no longer express opinions or raise questions that only days before were acceptable, even though no facts of the matter have changed. At an individual level, people who were within the bounds can be surprised to find themselves, quote, tormented by the slights and persecutions of daily obloquy, close quote. Once this occurs, he wrote, quote, your fellow creatures will shun you like an impure being, and those who are most persuaded of your innocence will abandon you too, lest they should be shunned in their turn, close quote.
Which we get, it's an interesting observation because it is true. Now, I like to think of politicians as just retarded, just their own political gain and nothing else. That's the only parameters that they can think within. What I find interesting is while you can see things like, even the true anti-vaxxers before COVID were mocked, but accepted, mostly. Things that were once okay to say are suddenly not. And then, of course, when politicians realized that they had no way out, that they'd picked the wrong fucking donkey in this horse, and they had to double down, and there was nothing more to double down on, they're out of fucking chips, they go, the science has changed. No, what is acceptable to say about the science has changed, because you've left yourself no way out, no off ramp. You have bet on the wrong horse. You get to the end of the fucking COVID line, and there's nowhere else to go. Now, if you admit that you were wrong and you backtrack and just with some humility go, you know what? I was fucking wrong. You might get a lot of credit for that, but you also might get voted out and suddenly be in the unemployment line. So you got to make up shit like the science has changed. But that's why something that was taboo is now able to be said, or something that was able to be said is now taboo. You want to test this line of thinking, just go on Twitter for 5 minutes.
In the midst of a pandemic, seeing the unvaccinated as impure is no surprise, because of course they could carry contagion. But as Tocqueville pointed out, this also occurs when there is no contagion, and we begin to experience those who are on the wrong side as impure, as in failing the purity test, and react to them as though they are dangerous. That we do this even when there is no pandemic suggests that there is, along with the realistic fear of infection, something else going on here. A sense that those with whom we may disagree are impurities in the body politic, bad people who need to be taught a lesson, even punished.
Which, in the eyes of the elites that look down upon us, raises a very interesting question, because, after all, if you believe in the blank slate theory, or philosophy, or outlook, John Locke, for example, if you look at that, then we are just machines to be programmed and corrected, persuaded, coerced, forced, re-educated, because we are just blank slates, right? You know, we can just be re-educated, like, you know, machines, reprogrammed, right? We just, you know, so we can pass the purity test, of course. Because if not, if we keep our own original programming, our own original line of inquiry, then in the political body, in the system, in the big machine, we are a problem. And so on that line of thinking, it is correct. But the solution would be to reprogram. It's kind of like how we've reused the word rehabilitating from just rehab for stuff like a broken leg or something to our jail systems. It's not a punishment, it's readjusting behavior, rehabilitating behavior, rehabilitating them back to be acceptable members of society, without the fact that maybe we're flawed human beings, not machines, to be toyed with or re-educated.
A June 2021 Gallup poll found that among the vaccinated, 53% now worry most about those choosing not to get vaccinated. Quote, surpassing concerns about lack of social distancing in their area, 27%, availability of local hospital resources and supplies, 11%, and availability of coronavirus tests in their area, 5%, close quote. True to the behavioral immune system's impulses, this fear is metastasizing into disgust, even hatred, of those who, because they believe or act differently, are now perceived as threats.
Correct. Very much correct. Matter of fact, they're perceived as threats that lift them higher than Corona itself. Now, I would ask what the reasoning for that would be. Is the reasoning for the reason, is it that we're not worried about Corona as much as the unvaccinated because we've realized that Corona isn't as deadly as once told? Or is it because of this delusioned push by the majority to where it's just the minority has to be out, whether it follows some kind of logic or not? I feel like it's pulling on different strings all at the same time. It's like some people might have been like, well, corona's not that bad, but you know what, you should have got vaccinated because, and it's like, well, if it's not that bad, then why? Well, just because, like, you can't follow that logic, but at the same time, it's pulling on the in-group versus the out-group, the elites versus the non-class warfare, racial warfare, when they say, well, COVID affected the minorities more than that, like, control. I feel like it's all these different chords, and I wonder if it's something beyond the behavioral immune system, or if it's all entwined in the same neurological structure to the brain. I would love to talk to this guy to pick his brain about it. But anyways.
On August 26th, in a front page story in the Toronto Star, my local newspaper, a resident was quoted as saying, quote, "I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated. Let them die." Close quote.
Again, think about that for a minute. It's like, is that person even aware of what they're saying, or aware that, why is it acceptable to say this about just an unvaccinated person? It bothers me on a particular level, because, like, behaviorally this should be unacceptable, and yet with the majority it is. And how quickly it's taking root, and how quickly it's acceptable. Whereas a couple years ago, you'd be like, oh my God, this is really violent talking points here. This is really disgusting. And now it's like, oh yeah, sure, yep. And it's curious.
In the midst of such a death wish for fellow human beings, even the person quoted understood that an important mental capacity has been lost: empathy, or the ability to model other people's minds. When we lose that en masse, the results can be tragic, not least because getting through this must be a group effort.
Fair. And I'm glad that he defined empathy, because people are like, empathy, you have no empathy. Oh my God, the empathy. And then you've got the scientific community going, dude, policy has no fucking room for empathy. Okay? Facts and logic defeat your emotions. My Jews quote, of course, empathy, who needs that? And it's like, empathy is the ability to model somebody else's emotions, to model why they would feel those emotions, to act out how somebody else feels and how they would get to feeling that way. Now, I wonder, is the lack of empathy because we simply don't understand how somebody could think that way? And is it because we just don't understand the history of government and what they've done with vaccines? And how much lying has been done with pharmaceuticals, which, if my YouTube channel gets wiped out for saying this, whatever. I wonder if it's a lack of empathy because of in-group, out-group, or if it's a mixture of ignorance. Or is it because the lack of consequence? Something somebody said to me the other day actually hinted at this a little more to me. Because, for example, if you say, well, why don't I go out and stab my ex-boyfriend? I'd go to jail. The consequence. Whereas, if I wrote in a paper, I'm going to go kill a black person, there would be an immediate consequence to me. Cancel culture being the least of it. If I were to say, I'm going to go stab a white person because they're white supremacist racists, suddenly I'd be applauded, no consequence, and I'm more likely to actually, in fact, print it for the likes, shares, and temporary fame I'm going to get. So is the ability to say, I have no empathy for these people, let them die, because there's no immediate consequence that is barring you from this kind of behavior? Or is it a lack of understanding for why this behavior is even a thing to begin with, or a mixture of both? Interesting, right?
As I understand it, there are two main approaches to public health in liberal democracies, and both have been tried historically in different places. One begins
Oh, and hey, sorry, I missed saying hello to HG6TV. Hello. Welcome to the chat and such, and thanks for the Canuck flag. It's super awesome. My apologies on the slow response here. I gotta rework my keep up with my frickin' chat muscles.
voluntarily, out of respect for civil liberties, but switches to coercion when some voluntary ceiling deemed insufficient is reached. Ideally, this intervention is based on the principle of least necessary coercion. The benefit to this is that it may work to get more people vaccinated in shorter order. But it also conveys that the government does not trust its citizens to make good decisions on their own.
Not just the government. If I were to give a random question and say, hey, what do you think of people? Most time I'd hear animals are better than people, or people are stupid, or people are retarded, or I hate people, blah, 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 blah. So, is it really just the government? I mean, the government publicly has stated without stating that it doesn't trust people to make good decisions, but do other people fall into that same wavelength, that they don't trust the citizens of their own communities to make good decisions, and thusly they're encouraging the government to force it because people are stupid, they don't know what they're doing without government oversight, right?
A condescension that in turn, this is human nature 101, eventually generates resentment, even revolt, and the disengagement of significant segments of the population.
Correct. Although I would adjust that started long before COVID, like generations before COVID. We've had an apathy problem since before the millennials at this point.
The other approach, participatory public health, sees the need for coercion as a sign that something in the public health outreach itself has failed. If a ceiling is reached, society's leaders should not simply resort to force, but rather confront the flaws in their own leadership. That they should double down on their responsibility to generate trust in the public.
Which is interesting because that means it's their flaws that has made it so people are vaccine hesitant, which would then negate the idea that maybe we're not mindless lemmings, that maybe the individual has independent thoughts. Holy crap, that's a great idea. Holy shit, I'm a freaking genius.
The goal of participatory public health is not to crush, but to better engage. In that spirit, what follows is an attempt by a physician and neuroscience writer and someone who got vaccinated early and voluntarily to understand those who have not made this choice. This
Is that even possible?
essay is not about COVID deniers or anti-vaxxers who oppose vaccines on ideological grounds, nor is it about the activists or political figures who feed off and benefit from the corrosive discourse around vaccines. It is instead about the vaccine hesitant, those who are concerned and anxious about COVID, but also anxious about these new vaccines. These are the people who are not yet vaccinated for reasons that the majority may not understand and which are often more anchored in history and experience than the majority would suspect.
Agreed. And this is where we get to the history of it all. And it's interesting because in this essay, once he lines out all of the times that either pharmaceuticals, pharmacies and big pharma or government or people or even doctors have fucked the dog, for lack of a better term. Screwed the pooch. You start to sit there and go, oh, shit. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's fucking understandable. God damn it.
They are the Tocquevillian minority that the majority is threatening with job loss and other restrictions. One needn't agree with the decisions or actions of the vaccine hesitant in order to learn something from them and about society as a whole. They pay attention to and are vigilant about different issues than the vaccinated and have strong feelings about the people and institutions involved in our public health.
Institutions that have been hollowed out, and unfeathered capitalism has actually screwed the pooch on. Now, I love capitalism. I really fucking do. Capitalism means that my Timmies can be super cheap compared to Starbucks, okay? I love the fucking capitalism. But side note, it still ain't fucking perfect. And here's the thing. Unfeathered capitalism with no leash can also be a problem. It really can be. And you'll kind of, you'll begin to understand why at some point. Because, for example, you know, if you don't challenge capitalism to stay honest, it doesn't. Because it's all about the moolah at that point, you know, money over ethics. And if the public is so disconnected that it can't keep a check on it, the founding fathers of America were correct on one thing. Power needs to check power. What they failed to realize is it's not just the government that you got to check on power. And yes, I know there are monopoly laws, but there are too many fucking loopholes to get away with that shit. I mean, look at Google. Like, let's be honest. And so when there's no checks and balances on corporations and big pharma, then it can run rampant just as quickly as a government, and it is even harder to leash, especially now since we've had years of, you know, libertarians and constitutionalists and whatnot going, dude, I will allow a private business to tell me what the fuck to do, but I won't allow government. And it's like, wait. Why is it only government that's not allowed to tell you what to do? What about large corporations trying to fucking pinhole you? What about that? So there shouldn't be any kind of ethics involved in that either. And that disconnect, it makes my brain explode with the blue screen of death.
Particularly politicians, the drug regulatory process, and pharmaceutical companies. For many, vaccine hesitancy is not simply about the vaccines. It's about the absence of faith in the wider systems that brought us the vaccines. Quote, public health moves at the speed of trust, close quote, notes physician and author Rishi Manchanda. If we want our public health system to function better, safer, swifter, in ways that more effectively safeguard the lives and livelihoods of all citizens, it must be rooted not in coercion, but in confidence, and not only among the majority. Chapter 2, The Kernel Brilliance of Vaccines.
The kernel brilliance of vaccines. See, I agree that vaccines are brilliant. Matter of fact, when the vaccine first came out, I praised Trump. I thought it was a great accomplishment. Hindsight's 2020, ladies and gentlemen, and I would say actually Trump's biggest mistake. He has empathy for people. He has empathy for the little guy. He loves his country, and he doesn't have the stomach to hurt people. He's kind of squishy when it comes to that, okay? He may love attention, but he's also squishy for his fellow human beings, and that's a problem. So COVID had been just doctored up and dolled up, whatever, to be this big fucking thing, and he's like, okay, what can I do? He looked in the mirror and went, all right, Trump, what are you going to do about it? And so he rolled back regulations. He rolled back test phases for Operation Warp Speed, which at the time I thought was brilliant because we needed a vaccine quick to save people. Hindsight being 2020, I realize now that while it was imperative that we found a solution quickly, taking out the process to ensure that a vaccine isn't going to do damage to more people than COVID would, not the best idea. And in fact, now that we know more about it, we should have actually put more of our bets on therapeutics. But that's a rant for another day.
The kernel idea of exposing a person to a weakened form of a pathogen or toxin, known colloquially as like to treat like, long preceded modern medicine and came in stages and through observation. Paracelsus, who was said to have treated persons during a plague of 1534, noted that, quote, what makes a man ill also cures him, close quote. During the ancient plague of Athens, 430 to 425 BCE, the historian Thucydides noted that those who, like himself, got the plague and then recovered, never got the plague again. Chinese writing alluded to inoculation in the 10th century, and in the 16th century, Brahmin Hindus were inoculating people with dried pus from smallpox pustules.
Gross, just saying. But it worked, but ew.
Similar practices, which were common in Turkey in the 1700s, were brought to England by the remarkable Lady Montagu, the English ambassador's wife. But when some, such as King George III's son, died of being inoculated with the smallpox, many became reluctant to undergo the procedure. A key advance occurred when farmers in England in the 1700s noticed that dairymaids who milked cows got cowpox on their hands from the udders. Cowpox was a very mild illness compared to smallpox, which had a 30% mortality rate by some estimates. It was observed that the maids with cowpox were immune to the dreaded smallpox. An English cattle breeder named Benjamin Jesty, who had himself contracted cowpox and was thus immune to smallpox, decided, supposedly on the spur of the moment, to intentionally inoculate his wife and children with cowpox. They remained immune to smallpox 15 years later.
Which is kind of amazing when you think about it. What I find actually the most amazing is how centered our focus can be. So, for example, if my son had got cowpox and was immune to smallpox, I'd be like, yep, okay. You know, I gave it to my son and he was totally fine. Thusly, everybody that does it should totally be fine. Whereas the person that had a child that died from this practice would then think, oh my God, everybody else is going to die too. And you would have, and it's like our center of focus broadens out to people to where our experiences should be everybody's experiences, despite the fact that just the time will tell you that that's not the case at all. However, this line of thinking, I remember listening to, I was on Facebook sharing baby photos because I'm a woman, and people were exposing their kids to chickenpox, to inoculate them quicker. Instead of getting the vaccine for it, because they're anti-vaxxers, they would have chickenpox parties and measles parties to inoculate their kids by just getting the disease, which, now understanding this, technically is rooted in truth. But that, as everything, a vaccine or exposing to disease both pose risks. You need to weigh which risk has a higher probability of killing you or your offspring. And that's where that's what we tend to forget. The probability of an individual assessing risk for themselves, because that's a key component to survival. And it's something that we usually forget.
The English physician Edward Jenner, learning of this, began systematically exposing patients to cowpox, including an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. He exposed James to cowpox and then exposed him to smallpox to see if he'd contracted, an experiment conducted quite obviously without informed consent. The boy survived and was vaccinated 20 times without bad effect, said Jenner, who reported on the benefits of the procedure in warding off smallpox in a series of cases. He was initially ridiculed for this idea, but in the end prevailed. The phenomenon was soon called vaccination, from Wacchinia, the Latin for cowpox virus species, wacca being cow. Some have even wondered whether the ancient Western symbol for the medical arts and healing still used today, the rod of Asclepius, a serpent wrapped around a staff, may itself be an allusion to the kernel idea that something dangerous can also protect. According to the Greek myth, Asclepius was said to have healed people with snake venom, which can have some medicinal properties that were written about by Nicander. And interestingly, the same image appears in the Torah in Numbers 21:8. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived.
Now, whether that was a teaching of wisdom or from God, we can just ignore that. But it does allude to the idea that, you know, just because it's venom doesn't necessarily mean it's going to kill you if used properly. It's an interesting kind of debate of order versus chaos. Again, another rant for another stream.
All of which is to say that the heal-harm paradox is a deep archetype in the human psyche. And it came not from Big Pharma, but from everyday, often rural observations. One might even call them frontline observations.
Or experiments, if you want to be cynical.
About how nature works and how the immune system behaves. Among the great triumphs of vaccination are the elimination in the United States of the scourge of polio and the eradication of smallpox throughout the world. Indeed, perhaps because of these successes, many of us nostalgically imagine that their development and public acceptance came easily. But the real history shows a more textured picture.
I love how I said a textured picture. I'm like, way to sugarcoat that, bro!
A number of polio vaccines had to be tried. The initial vaccine studies had very little oversight, and the first vaccines left some children paralyzed.
Which, imagine 2022 if COVID vaccine left you paralyzed. Even one kid, they'd be like, fuck no. Whereas back then it's like, yeah, that happened. But we got a vaccine out of it.
The first truly effective vaccine, the Salk, had problems too. In 1955, a bad batch of over 120,000 doses from the Cutter Pharmaceutical Company contained the live polio virus, causing 40,000 cases of polio and killing 10.
And there's one case of history for people to go and fuck that. And no matter how they go, dude, polio vaccine. They're like, dude, fuck that.
The Cutter incident, as the event is now known, revealed the vulnerability of the systems that produce vaccines and remains one of the sources of the nightmare that so haunts the hesitant.
Yes, because at the end of the day, institutions are run by people and people are flawed and human error can be a thing. no matter how many policies you put in there, no matter how well trained people are, no matter how many years at the universities they got, human error, it fucking happens.
Getting the dreaded disease from the treatment. The incident was followed by efforts to improve the regulatory systems so that similar tragedies wouldn't be repeated.
Good luck with that one. Human problems, you know.
In the public's mind, perhaps the greatest triumph of vaccination was the mid-century worldwide eradication of smallpox, a horrifying scourge that was lethal in 30% of cases. The history, as it is often told, attributes the victory solely to vaccines. But as British physician Richard Halverson has written, it was not simply the product of a single blockbuster vaccine or campaign, as it is so often described, but rather a regime of multiple public health measures instituted alongside vaccination.
Your child can now be protected against all of these things. Dun, dun, dun!
The details here are quite interesting. Beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were a number of mass campaigns of inoculation with smallpox and then vaccination with cowpox that led to a decline in smallpox in the 19th century. By 1948, some physicians in England thought the illness was sufficiently well managed that mass vaccination of infants, which carried some risks, could wind down. And so, mass vaccination was replaced by a new, more individually focused strategy. If a case was reported, public health officials isolated the person and their contacts, and the contacts were vaccinated. This was called the surveillance containment strategy.
Or, as we now like to call it today, contact tracing. But the difference between them and us is COVID's way more fucking contagious, so good luck contact tracing at this point, especially with Omicron around, man.
It worked. After the cessation of vaccination in England, a few cases occurred in 1973 and 1978, but both were based on laboratory accidents. According to Halverson, the World Health Organization came to the same conclusion and also adopted the surveillance containment approach elsewhere. In 1980, the disease was declared eradicated. But alongside the public health system's triumphant eradication of polio and smallpox from the 1940s through the 1970s, there was a horrifying chapter as well, one that included staggering abuses by public health and medical authorities.
And this is where we get into the good stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, screwing the pooch.
The Tuskegee experiment, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service from 1932 until 1972, sent out representatives to find African American men with syphilis who were told they would receive treatment for their, quote, bad blood, close quote. No treatment occurred. The officials gave these men a placebo instead of penicillin, which would have saved them. This was done so the investigators, by watching the men die slowly, could study the natural course of the devastating disease.
Which, interestingly enough, every time this is brought up, I've never actually been enlightened on why that would be necessary information. You know, how to treat the fucking thing, how to eradicate the fucking thing, how to not get it in the first place, all legit, but watch it naturally take its course in a body to see what happens if somebody has it forever. The only thing that I could see coming of that is to know when somebody has, like, you're about to die from syphilis symptoms or something. As for the actual function of that study and why it took so many people and so many years of watching that, you could chalk up to racism. You could chalk up to unfeathered curiosity or pride. Like there's multiple reasons. I've just never been enlightened on why. Not that why is really ever, it was never okay. I'm curious as to why. Maybe it was unfeathered ambition. You never know.
During the same period of time, the U.S. public health system oversaw 70,000 sterilizations of, quote, mentally deficient, close quote, people with learning problems, the blind, and the poor, and
Bastards.
also forcibly removed the uteruses of African American and indigenous women, all as part of an international eugenics movement that swept through public health.
But yet, we're only taught about the Germans. You know, even though they lifted a lot of that probably from us, but hey.
Psychedelics and other drugs were given to people in mental institutions without telling them, often leading to nightmare trips, and dangerous campaigns were undertaken based on only partial knowledge, such as the widespread radiation of healthy children's thymus glands, a key part of one's immune system, which later caused cancers.
Ooh.
All of these programs used abstract, population-based thinking, dehumanizing people into numbers to be toyed with in the name of science and progress.
As we can see, not very progressive. Not very, well, okay, totally sciencey. Even science, you gotta be careful that it's, unchecked science can just screw with you. Night, Credible Threat. Thanks for stopping by and listening. It's been coolio.
None of the public health abuses during this period involved informed patient consent. And yet they were government-sponsored, lauded, and justified.
I love that line too, by the way. This will kind of conclude. I'm going to play a couple more minutes of this and then conclude. But informed patient consent. Now, with the COVID stuff, this is where I get into the crux of this one. If you're not told about side effects, if you're not told about, oh shit, you're going to need 5 different boosters, if you're not told about any of this shit, is it really informed patient consent? The answer would be no. It's government sponsored, pharma backed, everybody, yeah, go get it, you fucking have to. And yet, big fucking flaw. No, nobody has given their informed consent ever for this shit at this point. I feel like history right now is repeating itself. Maybe not as bloody, but it's still repeating itself. Power needs to check power everywhere, not just the government, but in everything, including the science.
In the name of the greater good.
Name of the greater good. Oh, where have we heard that one?
It took the revelation of Nazi medical experiments on Jews and others to give rise to a new ethics of consent for research subjects.
A new ethics of consent that has already been for fucking gotten. Wow. I mean, Jesus.
The Nuremberg Code of Ethics of 1947, along with the 1964 Declaration of Helsinki, originally developed by the World Medical Association, required physicians and scientists to obtain the informed consent of all research subjects. This breakthrough led to the normalization of patient consent, not just for research subjects, but for those undergoing all medical procedures, and became a bedrock of what many of us in the medical field now see as an inviolable code of ethics.
Yeah, and it took, 70 years for that to be just blown apart? 70 fucking years? Alright, on that happy note, because I feel like he's going to have a pause here. It'll be good to leave it here for part 3, which will either be on Friday or Monday. For future viewers or present viewers, let me know what you think about needlepoints. Let me know if you like this kind of discussion, if you like this kind of information, or if it bores the ever-living snot out of you. Thanks for watching, and future listeners too. Comment, send me a hello or something, and let me know. Peace.
Here in our capital city, families and small businesses have been enduring illegal obstruction of their neighborhoods, occupying streets, harassing people, breaking the law. This is not a peaceful protest.